you're all extremely welcome here this evening for our March lecture. And on behalf of the Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I give you a very, very warm welcome. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce the speaker this evening, Dr. Oliver Whelan. Oliver is, of course, well known to us here in the Society, and to many of you here present this evening as well. Born in Hacketstown and went to school there, then went to Knockbeg, and then would have gone to UCD, and then spent 3 years in Canada at the University of Toronto. He came back to Ireland and worked with the Department of Finance, and then transferred to the National Treasury Management Agency when it was founded, and became a director of the NTMA. A most important position because it concerned all government borrowing at the time, and is now a huge organisation or a huge agency at this particular stage. So Oliver played a hugely important role in the management agency, and he then retired and began studying in Maynooth, got an MA in history, and leading on to a PhD. And he is an authority on this particular part of history that he has studied deeply, and we are really very, very grateful and very privileged to have him here this evening. And I will simply say, Oliver, a very warm welcome. Thank you for coming and giving us this lecture this evening. We very much look forward to it. The title is Landlords and Tenants in County Carlow, 1879 to 1960. Dr. Oliver Whelan.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for your kind words there. Tonight I'm going to deal with the land question in County Carlow from the beginning of the land war in 1879, going on to 1959-60, when the Land Commission divided the last remaining land in the Oak Park and Browns Hill estates. In 1879, virtually all of the land in Carlow was owned by landlords and worked by their tenants. The major landlords who lived in the county and dominated the political life of the time was MacMurrough Kavanagh in Borris, Bruen in Oak Park, and Rathdonnell in Lisnavagh. Now, landlords from other counties also had substantial holdings in Carlow, such as the Earl of Bessborough from Kilkenny and the Catholic landlord Muro Farrell from Kildare. The beginning of the land war was triggered by what we call the Little Famine of the late 1870s. The failure of the potato crop caused severe hardship, especially for labourers and small farmers. And in Carlow, the landlords and the larger farmers and shopkeepers combined to provide relief to many families who faced near starvation. In Tullow, for example, the relief committee was formed to help 50 or 60 families who were in distress. And Father Nolan, the administrator of the parish, was nominated and seconded as chairman of the relief committee by two of Tullow's Protestant landlords, Hardy Eustace and Sir Clement Wolseley. The most comprehensive effort to deal with the Little Famine came from the Mansion House Fund, which was set up in January 1880 by the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Edmund Dwyer Gray. And Dwyer Gray, of course, was to be elected an MP for Carlow County in April of 1880, just after that. And the fund, it provided money for local committees for the distribution of food. There were five relief committees in County Carlow and the neighbouring districts of Great Cullen and Killeshan. which received help from the Mansion House Fund. And in those areas, there was deprivation on a vast scale. Loughlin Bridge expected about 1,000 people would need help. Newtown, Ballymoiler, the figure was 700 to 800 people. And there was 500 each in Hacketstown and Killeshan, and 300 in Clonmore. So it was very widespread deprivation. Now, the position improved as work became available for labourers on the farms in the spring of 1880. And so the harvest of 1880 was comparatively good. So the Mansion House Fund was wound up in December of that year after a short but valuable existence. The Little Famine, we call it, triggered demands by tenants for rent reductions from their landlords. And the first big demonstration in Leinster against the landlords was when about 15,000 people gathered in Tullow on the 28th of September 1879. And that meeting was addressed by Charles Stewart Parnell. And those invited to attend included Michael Davitt and Matthew Harris, who was the chief Fenian organiser in the west of Ireland, and Thomas Brennan, a Dublin-based Fenian. Now, Father Nolan, who chaired the meeting, and some members of the organising committee felt they might be compromised by sharing a platform with men of such advanced opinions. And the Fenians, Brennan and Harris, arrived in Tullow, but were obliged to stand down from the meeting platform. And Edward O'Toole, the Rathvilly school teacher who helped organise this meeting, was one of the main Fenian organisers in County Carlow at the time. So his hand was in that. But despite all that, the semi-revolutionary connections, the speakers at the Tullow meeting used very moderate language in demanding rent reductions in the face of the shortage of food and the general depression of the economy. And they acknowledged, nonetheless, that there were some good landlords, such as Bessborough in Kilkenny, who had about 10,000 acres in Carlow. And the National Land League was established in 1879 in reaction to the excessive rents being charged by many landlords during the agricultural depression of that period. And following the Tullow demonstration in September 1879, the first Land League branch in Carlow was founded also in Tullow in February 1880. The branch was established in Rathvilly in November 1880. And by March 1881, there were 13 branches across the county. The leadership of the Land League in County Carlow mainly comprised large farmers, shopkeepers and priests. For example, the leaders of the Tullow branch of the League included substantial farmers such as Patrick Hanlon and John Reid of Grangeford. Hanlon was from a wealthy Catholic family with extensive landholdings in Carlow and Laois, and John Reid had a farm of almost 160 acres and was obviously among the wealthier class of farmers. So what was the response of the landlords then to the demand from the tenants for some rent relief? Well, in December 1879, Bessborough offered a 10% rent reduction to East County Carlow tenants. And that brought the rents down to the level of Griffith's valuation, that is, to the levels in around 1850 and 1860. And Moore O'Farrell of Kildare reduced the rents on his holding, say, in Chinook in Rathvilly Parish by 20%. Other landlords who lived in Carlow, such as Wolseley of Tullow and Packberesford of Fenagh, generally gave rent reductions of 10 to 15%. The three major resident landlords in the county, the Rathdonnell, Kavanagh and Bruen, they were initially reluctant to yield to the pressure for rent relief. But Rathdonnell's land agent took the risk of going beyond his master's instructions not to offer more than a 10% reduction. In March 1881, the agent persuaded the group of 10 Rathvilly tenants that the 20% reduction which they were seeking was not available, but that he could give them 15% if they all paid up at once. And it was interesting that while hoping that Rathdonnell wouldn't be too vexed with him, the agent reminded Rathdonnell that Rathdonnell had said he wanted the money. In November 1881, MacMurrough Kavanagh threatened to issue writs for the eviction of 160 of his tenants. Now, Kavanagh eventually accepted that many of his smaller tenants were unable to pay, and he decided to take advantage of what's known as the Arrears of Rent Act of 1882. Under that act, the government would pay the landlord half the amount of rent owed by the tenants, and the other half was written off. So the tenants were relieved of that. And he applied that to 123 of his smaller tenants, and he picked up a sum of £850 for the rent, the half year's rent, which they were in arrears for, and the rest was written off. Henry Bruen at first refused to countenance any reduction in rent. But now, in response to the Little Famine, the government had enacted what they called the Seed Supply Act of 1880 to encourage local authorities to purchase potatoes for their smallholders. And it was thanks largely to Henry Bruen's efforts in early 1880 that the Carlow Poor Law Union provided seed potatoes to its smallholders. And apart from that scheme, Bruen and several other landlords, including Butler in Tullow and Stopford in Clonmore, privately supplied seed potatoes to their tenants. And Bruen also gave general rent reductions of 5 to 15%. The big change in his approach. But in 1880, there was also a general election in April of that year. And in that election, the 2 Carlow county seats were being contested for the first time in almost 30 years. They had been just uncontested by the landlord class for the previous 30 years. So the movement, the Home Rule Party under Parnell, basically there were 2 candidates put forward, Edmund Dwyer Gray and Donald McFarlane, who was a Scottish guy who had land here and was operating in Ireland. And they won the 2 seats at the expense of the landlords, MacMurrough Kavanagh and Henry Bruen. And that Home Rule pair had a clear victory of 64% against 36%. So with that, the landlords' political dominance in the county was shattered at that time. And at the same time, the focus of the land movement became more radical during 1880, with much less energy devoted to seeking rent reductions and an increasing emphasis placed on opposing land grabbing and promoting tenant ownership of their farms. As you know, land grabbing was when a tenant leased a farm from which another person had been evicted. And there was a major meeting in Tullow in October 1880, and the tone was quite different from the one just a year earlier in 1879. At the Tullow meeting, the chairman was Father Delaney, who was parish or curate in Clonegall, and he launched this rabble-rousing attack on the gentry with no reference to good landlords. The landlords were, he says, unjust and intolerable, bigoted and overbearing, arrogant and parsimonious in their dealings with the public, with the poor. Now, and it was the policy of the Land League to impose costs on landlords by boycotting farms where tenants had been evicted. The boycott would ensure that the farm remained idle. For example, a Land League meeting in St Mullins in July 1881 was concerned about some persons who had, they said, rented lands from which tenants had been unjustly evicted. And those people were said to be worse than any traitors in Irish history. So this strong language, emphasising it was the feeling of the time. And the most common motive for agrarian crime at this time was to prevent land grabbing or to punish those who had grabbed land. And in a paradox, really, the 1881 Land Act weakened the Land League. The tenants in Carlow and elsewhere flocked to have their rents fixed by the new land courts established by that act, despite the efforts of Parnell and some of the leaders to cast doubts on the merits of the new land courts. And in this regard, the Land League decided to ask 2 tenants in each district to determine a fair rent for their farm, and no higher a rent than that was to be paid by anybody in the area. Now, this was seen by the government as an attempt to usurp the rent-fixing powers of the new land courts. And the government responded by arresting Parnell and the other leaders of the Land League in October 1881. And when Parnell then issued the No Rent Manifesto, calling for a universal rent strike, the government outlawed the Land League as an illegal organisation. And following the arrest of Parnell and the other leaders, 10 prominent members of the Land League in County Carlow were also arrested in the period from October 81 to January 1882. So we have in Tullow, there were 3 people there: Daniel Lennon, Gerald O'Toole, and James L. White. And 2 people in Ballon, John Keighley and James Murphy. We had in Hacketstown E.P. Kelly, John Lyons, and Nicholas O'Toole. And in Borris, James Bruen and James Collins. And the Land League organised a huge publicity campaign for its imprisoned members. Very publicly and in large numbers, Land League members, for instance, carried out seasonal work which could not be delayed on the prisoners' farms. Just for example, in December 1881, farmers threw home the potato and turnip crops of Daniel Lennon in Tullow. And it was said 100 cars and several hundred people then processed from the field to Tullow, headed by the local brass band. And large demonstrations were also held when prisoners were released. So when James L. White of Tullow was released from Naas Jail, he was met at Carlow train station by a brass band, and Tullow, it was said, was most brilliantly illuminated to greet him. Gerald O'Toole of Tullow was one of the earliest suspects to be released. He was released in December 1881 after 58 days in custody. John Keighley of the Ballon branch was released in February 82 after 39 days detention. Others, such as John L. White and Nicholas O'Toole of Hacketstown, were not released until well into April 1882. Parnell, as it turns out, was released from Kilmainham jail on the 2nd of May 1882 after agreeing what's called the Kilmainham Treaty with Gladstone, the British Prime Minister. And basically, Parnell promised to try and quieten things down, and Gladstone offered to help the poor tenants with rent relief. So the Rent Relief Act that I referred to earlier was as a result of this meeting between Parnell and Gladstone, or this compromise between them anyhow. So he provided this half year's rent relief for the poorer or the smaller tenants, and that was widely used, including in Carlow. And a year after the suppression of the Land League, Parnell founded a successor organisation, the Irish National League. That was in October 1882. And this new body was the main support base for the Irish Parliamentary Party in Westminster, and continued the campaign for land reform and home rule. And briefly, in the second half of the 1880s, the news, I suppose, was dominated by what we call the plan of campaign. And that was a result of a sharp fall in agricultural incomes in the mid 1880s. And it was targeted at financially weak landlords to compel them to grant rent reductions. Now, the plan was adopted mainly in Munster and Connacht, and it was not adopted on any estate in County Carlow, though it did receive a lot of publicity in the county, particularly regarding the evictions in Lubicurran in Laois, where the plan was adopted, and also in Coolgraney in County Wexford, where there was also similar evictions. But it didn't really affect County Carlow as such. But I suppose the political earthquake really at the end of that period was the Parnell divorce case. So at the end of 1890, the Parnell split occurred, and it resulted in the land and political movements being split into two opposing blocks. And it also had the effect that some of the leading figures in the political and land movement in Carlow withdrew from active involvement with either faction. And these included, for example, Patrick Hanlon and John Reid of Grangeford. They were active locally, but not in those organisations. Now, in February 1891, the anti-Parnellite and Parnellite members in Carlow Town held separate meetings. The anti-Parnellite meeting had the greater support and enlisted about 50 new members. It was chaired by local businessman Michael Malloy. And the Parnellite meeting was less well supported. It was chaired by Michael Governey of Carlow here. And there was a degree of support for Parnell in the town, and 14 new members signed up at that meeting. But unease at the Parnell split delayed the establishment of branches of the new anti-Parnellite organisation, the Irish National Federation, in some areas of the county. Borris, Ballon, Tullow, Rathdonnell, all weren't sure which way to go for a good while. So it took some months to sort things out. However, they were sorted out decisively at the end of the day. Speaking of Rathdonnell, there was some tension when the branch there of the Irish National League was dissolved and replaced by the Anti-Parnellite National Federation in April 1891. The parish priest advised the young men of the parish to come armed, he said, with light sticks to be used in self-defence in case there was a disruption by Parnellite gangs of rowdies. And true enough, some 15 to 20 Parnellite supporters from Rathdonnell, County Wicklow, you wouldn't say they were rowdies, tried to disrupt the meeting. But such was the tension that they, in fact, who had to be protected by the police at the end of the day. But overall, there were 10 active branches of the new anti-Parnellite Irish National Federation in the county in 1892. And the Parnellite cause was losing ground. There was a noteworthy decision, in my mind anyhow, to move on from past allegiances and join the mainstream political movement, when in November 1892, a group of his parishioners requested the parish priest of Hacketstown to be president of a new branch of the anti-Parnellite Irish National Federation in Knocknanana. That was, of course, in Hacketstown parish. And the success in establishing this branch is a good indicator of the decline in Parnellite support, even in this area, which would have included or be close to Parnell's hunting lodge in Knocknanana. And also in Carlow, in July 1891, there was a by-election, and the anti-Parnellite candidate was John Hammond, who was to represent the county for a long time. He soundly defeated the Parnellite candidate, Andrew Kettle, with 71% of the vote. So I think there were no more attempts in Carlow to run the Parnellite side until the party were united around 1900. It was the end of that that particular episode. We'll have a brief look now at how tenants bought their farms from their landlords. And tenant purchases of their holdings in Carlow only began to register following the passing of the Land Act in 1896. And following that, the Earl of Bessborough, the Kilkenny landlord, sold 3,000 acres of his land to his Carlow tenants in 1898. And the negotiations on the tenant side were led by Patrick Hanlon of Grangeford, who published his holding of 336 acres. And his neighbour, Catherine Reid, who was the widow of the John Reid, who was Hanlon's former colleague in the land movement, she also purchased her holding of 158 acres. However, none of the major landlords who were resident in Carlow sold significant amounts of their land in the county under this 1896 Land Act. Overall in Carlow, 26 landlords sold some lands to their tenants, totaling about 12,000 acres in the period from 1890 to 1903 roughly. So it was a very small beginning over a period of 12, 13 years, 12,000 acres. And of course, the major Land Act was just around the corner. That was the Wyndham Land Act of 1903. And significant purchases of their holdings commenced when that act was passed. George Wyndham was the Chief Secretary for Ireland in the British government. Wyndham's Land Act, the government bought the land from the landlords and transferred ownership to the tenants who paid for the land through land annuities over 68 and a half years. The landlords were paid in cash. That hadn't always been the case under the earlier legislation. Sometimes they were paid in land bonds, they were paid in cash, and also they received a 12% bonus on each cash sale. So the bonus was the key in encouraging the landlords to sell. Now, looking at how the Wyndham Act was made, or how it fared out in Carlow, certain things emerge. The area movers in Carlow to sell their lands under this act included the smaller resident landlords who had no lands outside the county, and they sold their entire estates apart from a domain around their residence, and their families often continued to live in the county after the sales. So Beresford, whose only holding of land was roughly 6,355 acres near Hacketstown, completed the sale of his entire estate in March 1906 for the sum of £121,000. And the family continued to live in Fenagh until around 1986. The Keogh family of Kilbride House, who also had no land outside the county, sold their estate of almost 1,400 acres while retaining about 200 acres themselves. And the son of that family continued to live in Kilbride until 1927, when the house was burned in a suspected case of arson. Now, the non-resident landlords, that'd be the guys who didn't live in County Carlow but had that property here, they generally sold their Carlow lands under the Wyndham Act. Just for example, Sir Robert Joshua Paul of Ballyglan, County Waterford, he sold almost 1,400 acres in Carlow. That was in Hacketstown. Moore O'Farrell, the landlord from Kildare, he sold his entire holdings of almost 4,000 acres in Carlow. And his lands were mainly around Michael and Ballon and some around Rathvilly. Now, there are exceptions to this, and in contrast, the Doyne family, who we'll be hearing about later, who held 4,000 acres in Carlow and 7,000 in Wexford, retained most of the land, and their sales in Carlow under Wyndham amounted to less than 700 acres, quite a small portion of their land. And then just what about the three big guys? How did they fare? Rathdonnell, Bruen, and Kavanagh. Well, an interesting aspect there, I suppose. Rathdonnell sold 966 acres from his Lisnavagh estate, and these were his only sales in County Carlow under this Wyndham Act. However, his total sales outside the county were almost 10 times greater at 9,200 acres. And he received approximately £170,000 from his land sales, an absolute vast amount. Henry Bruen, he intended that his Carlow lands would remain in the family while his estates in Wexford and Galway would be sold. And accordingly, his son Henry Jr., who had taken over management of the estate, sold almost 5,000 acres outside County Carlow while selling about 1,800 of his Carlow holdings. We look at MacMurrough Kavanagh. Walter MacMurrough Kavanagh was the man in Borris at this time. He sold his 7,000 acres in Kilkenny. And in January 1908, he very reluctantly sold 7,700 acres to some of his Carlow tenants. And the reason for this was that Kavanagh wanted to contest a by-election in Carlow in 1908 as a nationalist. And he was told by Bishop Foley of Kildare and Loughlin that it would not be possible for him to get the nomination for the by-election unless he agreed to sell the land to the tenants. So anyway, Kavanagh was elected unopposed in that election in 1908. The net result of Kavanagh's land sales under the Wyndham Act was that he still had 8,000 acres in Carlow and 4,000 acres in Wexford. And he received a total of 183,000 for his sales, again, vast amounts. But basically, none of the large landlords wanted to sell their home estates in Carlow. To the greatest extent possible, they would sell land only outside the county, and unless Kavanagh, like Kavanagh, you had good reasons for selling land in your home county for political advantage. Yeah. Now, one of the weaknesses of the Wyndham Act, despite all the success in transferring ownership to the tenants, was that it did little to deal with the structural problems of the large number of small, uneconomic holdings in the county, or indeed in the country in general. And it was to deal with this problem that the United Irish League was founded by William O'Brien in Westport in 1898. It campaigned to have large grazing farms divided among smallholders and landless men. And the O'Brien's main interest was not in defeating landlords, but in dividing up land, whether it was owned by landlords or by anybody else. It wasn't just an anti-landlord thing. It was more a dividing up of the large estates to make room for more people. And the United Irish League in Carlow, it has to be said, was fairly ineffective. And just to quote, the Tullow branch of the League remarked in November 1909 that apathy was displayed towards the United Irish League until a convention was called or the election of an MP was under consideration, when the Tullow people said branches of the League mysteriously spring into existence and vanish almost as quickly. However, there was some trouble, I'll say, around this time, despite the weakness of the United Irish League in Carlow. In the area around Borris, there were a number of attempts to compel landowners to sell their holdings to the Land Commission for division. In 1909, a campaign was waged to compel Captain Fitzmaurice to sell his farm in Killedmond for distribution among locals. Ultimately, that campaign failed, and Fitzmaurice didn't put his farm up for sale until 1919. And ironically, while the official policy of the United Irish League was to have grazing lands divided, the graziers themselves in the Borris branch of the League adopted a resolution opposing the anti-grazier campaign for fear, as the police remarked, that if the campaign was successful, they would be the sufferers. So it was really a fairly weak event in Carlow. In 1910, the Land Commission told the Marshall branch of the United Irish League that the Commission had offered higher prices for land in Carlow than in any other county, but to no avail. The landlords preferred to rent their untenanted land under the 11-month system. These short-term lettings were exempt from the government's rent controls, which were introduced in the Land Act of 1881. But general feeling was changing in Carlow. The Nationalist local newspaper here said in 1914 that the lack of interest in the young people in the National League, he said, the rising generation has no sympathy with the land question, which is practically the only question discussed at meetings of the United Irish League. It said that there is more to nationality than transferring the ownership of land from one section of the Irish people to another. There is a great opportunity for the United Irish League if its programme were enlarged. And other organisations such as the Gaelic League, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and Sinn Féin were seen as more relevant and attractive for young people. And in the 1918 general election campaign, the Irish Parliamentary Party tried to defend its achievements by stressing its record on the land question. But as we all know, that had little effect. I just briefly talked about some of the land agitation in the period of the War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, a period of disturbance and lawlessness in many respects. And part of the background to the land agitation was that land purchase by tenants under the British Land Acts ground to a halt with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, as the British government concentrated all its efforts on the war effort. And at the same time, demand for land increased because the Irish agricultural economy prospered during the war. Just after the war, during 1919 and 1920, there was a general tendency for agitation to have large areas of land divided whenever the opportunity arose, particularly when a farmer bought additional land. So just one or two examples of that. Michael Rice bought a portion of a farm near Hacketstown in the face of local opposition. And in retaliation, his hay was burned in August 1919 and again in January 1920. And similarly, Henry Yeager from Castlecomer bought a large farm in Clougrennan in April 1920. And in the following few months, much of the fencing on his farm was maliciously damaged and his cattle were driven from the land. And this land was also wanted for distribution. Yeager continued to be subject to threats and intimidation, which led to his financial ruin and eventually to the sale of his lands by the Land Commission in 1930 to meet his debts. Non-residential farms, that's where the farmer wasn't living on the land, it was a second farm perhaps, were also targeted and made unworkable in the hope that they would be divided among locals by the Land Commission. So in July and August 1920, cattle were driven from the lands of John Salter at Ballyryan near Hacketstown on 4 separate occasions as local people wanted the land for division. Salter had 4 separate pieces of land. In April 21, Thomas Rothwell of Nurney was ordered by a group of 4 men to give up his non-residential farm in Ballylochan. Small landowners wanted the farm for distribution. Ultimately, the intimidation of Salter and Rothwell was successful, as in both cases, the Land Commission took over the lands in 1929 and divided them. Now, and these agrarian disturbances occurred at a time in the War of Independence when the RIC had been withdrawn from most rural and small town barracks from early 1920. And another offshoot of the demand for land in the period after the First World War was the emergence of local land committees who would club together to buy land for their members. Again, like these sprung up because the Land Commission had been forced to abandon its role in land purchase because of the war. The British government didn't have resources to devote to it. But there was a danger for the nationalist movement with these land committees, and to avert the danger that this land agitation might interfere with the struggle for political independence, the First Dáil established the National Land Bank, and its purpose was to provide funds for these local committees to purchase lands. And there were 12 land committees in Carlow. 3 of these in Kilcumney, Rathwade and Garryhundon borrowed from the National Land Bank to purchase lands. 3 other committees, Kellistown, Duckett's Grove and Rathdonnell, borrowed directly from the commercial retail banks. And 6 of the committees failed to purchase any land, despite their making serious efforts. Now, the National Land Bank itself was interesting. It had two models for land purchase. The first was that each member of the land committee would become the owner of a separate holding. The second was that the land would be farmed cooperatively by the members of the land committee without subdivision. And an experiment using the cooperative farming method was carried out at Kilcumney in 1920, but it was a failure from the outset and had to be abandoned, and the farm was eventually taken over by the Land Commission. Now, 2 other land committees who borrowed from the National Land Bank purchased land in 1921. The Garryhundon Land Committee bought 293 acres from Richard Butler in Ballintemple, and the Nurney Land Committee purchased 150 acres in Rathwade from Captain Forbes. Both land committees failed to divide the land among their members, and both were eventually taken over by the Land Commission. As the land committees became insolvent during the agricultural depression in the early 1920s, there was a huge fall in agricultural prices. And just to look at how the land committees who borrowed from the commercial banks, did they do any better? In September 1919, Charles Doyne agreed to sell his 1,000 acres roughly of his Kellistown land to the local committee in Kellistown. And the committee borrowed £42,000 from the Munster and Leinster Bank to buy the land. Now, the committee members who signed the purchase deal and guaranteed the repayment of the bank loan were all significant local figures, including Michael Governey and 2 merchants from Tullow, James Dempsey and Gerald O'Toole. These men who guaranteed the bank borrowing had no interest in obtaining any of the land for themselves. The objective was always to divide the land among local smallholders and landless men. Now, the Kellistown Committee was unable to carry out its plan to divide the land, mainly due to the high price it paid for the land. So when land prices collapsed in the early 1920s, the debt of the Land Committee grew as the income from letting the land wasn't enough to cover the interest costs of the loan, which the committee had borrowed from the Bank of Ireland. It kept going deeper underwater. And there was considerable pressure on the government from Carlow politicians to ensure that the Land Committee members who had signed the bank guarantee would not suffer any personal losses. And eventually in 1929, the Land Commission took over the Hacketstown lands and repaid the bank debt themselves. The experience of the Killerig or Duckett's Grove Lands Committee was similar in many respects to that of Hacketstown. The Killerig Committee purchased 1,400 acres of the neighbouring estate of Duckett's Grove. And the committee there was made up of 4 trustees who would guarantee the committee's bank borrowings and 28 smallholders and labourers to whom the land would be distributed. And the committee borrowed £30,000 from the Bank of Ireland for this purchase. But with no great luck, by 1925 the committee had failed to agree on the division of the land because of conflicting views of its members, and no repayment had been made on the loan to the bank. So the bank issued a new bill for $38,000 to the guarantors. And again, in 1929, the Land Commission also agreed to take over the lands in Duckett's Grove and to repay the bank loan. Now, running through all the actions of the land movement was the question of evicted tenants, the people who were called the wounded soldiers of the land war. How did they fare out? And I'll give a few examples to show what happened to them in the period from the beginning of the land war in 1879 to about 1923, how they had fared out. The first one I did was in 1881. Charles Davis Guinness inherited an estate of 2,000 acres around Hacketstown. He found that several of his tenants in Hacketstown had joined the land war campaign and were refusing to pay rents any higher than Griffith's valuation. And Guinness took steps to evict the tenants in November 1881. Protest meetings to disturb the evictions were planned, but were forbidden by order of Dublin Castle. The farms on which these 20 tenants were evicted came to about 800 acres. And the Land League campaign made it difficult for Guinness to find anybody to manage the evicted farms. Melville Key was the postmaster and shopkeeper in Kiltegan, and he provided accommodation and assistance to Guinness, though he was boycotted by the Land League. And the shopkeepers in Baltinglass refused to buy bread from Key's bakery because he also supplied bread to the police. A very stringent boycott of anybody interfering with the process. But despite all of this, about 8 of the evicted tenants had various secret contacts with Guinness with a view to returning to their holdings. They were all able to pay, but they had joined the rent strike under pressure from the Land League. And eventually the campaign collapsed at the end of December 1881 when one of the larger tenants broke ranks by paying rent and returning to his farm. And that really ended the whole protest. The Guinness lands, in fact, were taken over by the Land Commission not until 1931 as part of the Free State dealing with the ending of landlordism, if you like. And the Guinness case is very unusual for Carlow. There are no other examples of a large group of tenants being evicted and leaving their premises for a prolonged period. I'll look at a few more individual cases. Timothy Nolan, for instance, was evicted from 191 acres in Ballyhacket by Henry Bruen in 1886. He owed 1.5 years' rent, totaling £562. Nolan's case is unusual for County Carlow in that he was estranged from his other large farmers in the district. Some members of the National League, particularly in Tullow, were very hostile to him on the grounds that though he was one of the largest Catholic tenants in the county, he gave no assistance to the League. And the National League took no action on Nolan's behalf. And there was considerable interest in leasing his land from other people following the eviction. And virtually all of those interested in leasing Nolan's land from Bruen were substantial farmers or businessmen from the local area. They included, for instance, Dr. Kidd of Tullow, who had rented several other large farms, and Robert Fenton, who used to hunt with Bruen. Now, people who were less close to Bruen generally asked influential local figures to write to Bruen on their behalf, put in a good word. Thus, the businessman George Cope from Castledermot was recommended to Bruen by the local rector, the Reverend Gall, who said he was anxious that the land would be held by honest Protestants. Eventually, Bruen leased Nolan's farm to Edward Wilson from Stratford-on-Slaney. Wilson was recommended by the local Justice of the Peace, Edward Albert Dennis, and the local rector, the Reverend Timothy Clifford O'Connor, both from Baltinglass. And the case is interesting. Bruen held out for the best possible price. He was unswayed by considerations of political or social standing. Wilson agreed to pay £1.16 per acre for the land, which was a bit more than anybody else had offered. So he got a commercial deal. There were two evictions in Ballon around this time, James Nolan and John Keeley. And they both had considerable local support. In July, Keeley was evicted from 212 acres for 1.5 years' rent, which amounted to about £300. Keeley refused to pay rent for the farm, which had been set by the land courts. And this was very unusual. Tenants generally accepted the land court's decisions, even if they were not always pleased with them. But he didn't. So the eviction followed. And in 1909, the Land Commission eventually reinstated Keeley locally on a farm of 50 acres. That was just 1/4 of his original holding. And James Nolan was evicted from a much bigger farm, 400 acres, by William Brown Clayton in May 1890. Nolan refused to accept a reduction offered by the landlords since he expected to get a more substantial rent reduction from the land courts. Now, he admitted that he was not careful to continue payment of rent and had allowed arrears of 1.5 years to build up. Now, Nolan was evicted, but since Nolan had another large farm, the Land Commission would not have attempted to reinstate him on the evicted farm, or indeed on any farm. As a side tail into that, the Nolan family regained most of that land 28 years later, when Dr. Kidd of Tullow sold his leasehold interest in 274 acres of the farm to James Nolan's brother Luke in February 1918. Now, under the 1903 Land Act, tenants evicted since the beginning of the Land War, that be in 1879, could apply to purchase their former holdings, or if these holdings were no longer available, the Land Commission could attempt to secure alternative holdings for them. That's a rather crowded slide, but I'll show you more later on. In Carlow, there were 122 evicted families who were unable to return to their farms, and they applied to the Land Commission for reinstatement. They were from different periods. The first period, 57 or almost half of those who applied for reinstatement were evicted during the period of the Land War from 1879 to 1884. This was the period of the most intense land agitation, and only 9 of those were reinstated ever. And the National League in Carlow was very weak in opposing evictions during most of the 1880s, and certainly during the period from the mid-1880s to the Plan of Campaign, which ended in 1891. And during this kind of 7-year period, of weakness, 37 tenants were evicted in Carlow, and only 9 of those were ever reinstated. The fizzling out of the planning campaign and the death of Parnell in October 1991 led to a relatively quiet period in Carlow. So during the 6 years from 1892 to 97, there were only 12 evictions in total in Carlow, and 6 of those were reinstated. And finally, in the 8 years from 1896 to 1906, coming into the Wyndham Act, covering the activity of the United Irish League, there were just 16 evictions in County Carlow, and again, 8 of those were reinstated. So in total, just 32 of the 122 who applied to the Land Commission for reinstatement were successful. Evictions actually didn't have a happy ending. From these figures, just over a quarter of those who were evicted in Carlow were reinstated, and many of them had to wait a very, very long time to be reinstated, 15, 20, 30 years. So it was a very slow process. So being evicted it wasn't a good fate. And 3/4 of them got nothing, a quarter got something. And the difficulty of getting back land, well, the land movement in Carlow shared the general view that any untenanted land, it had no tenants, should be preserved for distribution only to locals. But there was very little untenanted land available for distribution to anybody in Carlow. The Land Commission was able to acquire only 749 acres of untenanted land in County Carlow for evicted tenants. And all of this land was acquired from landlords who were resident in other counties and had relatively small holdings in Carlow. So none of the bigger landlords provided any land to the Land Commission to let evicted tenants back. And in fact, 8 evicted tenants from Carlow had to be settled in land outside the county, in County Wexford, County Laois, North County Dublin, and even Fermanagh. And you say, well, why were so few tenants reinstated? And that was the question. Well, Thomas Staunton, whose father was evicted from 12 acres in Borris in 1884, he failed in his attempt to return to his original holding, but in 1914, maybe 30 years later, he accepted reinstatement on 27 acres in Laois. And he aptly summarised some of the reasons why evicted tenants found it so difficult to be reinstated. He remarked that the ardour of the people for land agitation became somewhat cool because of the numerous concessions obtained under the Land Acts. And really, basically, there was no stomach for a fight for the evicted tenants. Once the major settlements had been made under the Land Act, rents had been settled under the land courts, and the buying out of land had been provided for. They could purchase your land from the landlords, and that took all the attention away from the evicted tenants in effect, although there was much noise, but nothing substantial. And then, after independence, what changes can be seen in the land policy of the independent Free State? Well, to diffuse the widespread agrarian agitation which took hold during the War of Independence and the Civil War, the government enacted new land legislation, the 1923 Land Act, and it's warned those who continued to engage in agrarian agitation that they would be excluded from the benefits of the Act. And the 1923 Act provided that all agricultural land in the state held by tenants, not by those who had bought out under the earlier acts, but those who were still tenants, that was to be vested in the Land Commission and would then be resold to or vested in the tenants, subject to the payment of land annuities by the tenants to the government, which were 30 or 35% lower than the rents the tenants previously paid to the landlords. Now, we have seen that the leading resident landlords in Carlow generally sold only their lands in other counties before independence. And they sold their Carlow lands only when obliged to do so under the 1923 Act. Basically, the land was confiscated, whether you liked it or not, and you were paid in prize bonds or in land bonds. Now, so the Land Commission basically had all of the tenanted land, and they took over, for instance, the lands of Bruen in November 1926, where 11,500 acres roughly passed to the Land Commission in 1929 as a first step to the tenants acquiring full legal ownership of their lands. And so Bruen was left with a domain of 1,500 acres with his residence in Oak Park, but all his land became the land of his tenants from the Land Commission. And in 1931, the Land Commission got 3,570 acres of Rathdonnell's Lisnavagh estate, leaving a domain of 1,291 acres with the house in Lisnavagh. So again, the tenants got ownership there. And we have seen that Walter Kavanagh of Borris was an exception when he reluctantly sold nearly half his Carlow land before independence. And that was due to his ambition to be nominated as a candidate for the Carlow by-election in 1908. Now, Kavanagh's remaining lands of 6,700 acres roughly, apart from the domain around Borris House, were acquired under the 1923 Land Act in May 1931. And there were a number of aristocratic landowners in the county with holdings of more than 2,000 acres, but much less than the big three of Bruen, Kavanagh and Rathdonnell. These aristocrats also sold virtually none of their Carlow lands before 1923. You had the Hall-Dare estate in Donegal, the Butler estate in Tullow, the Brown-Clayton estate in Browns Hill, and they sold very little, if anything, of the land until the lands were taken over under the 1923 Land Act by the Land Commission and vested in the tenants. Now, after independence, the Land Commission made very little progress in acquiring untenanted land in Carlow for distribution to small farmers or landless. Even before independence, the Land Commission had made very little progress there. But up to 1935, for example, the Land Commission here had acquired less than 2,000 acres in County Carlow. That was apart from the 4,000 acres which they took over from the 6 bankrupt land committees, which I referred to earlier. So really it was very little. And what happened then to the domain lands attached to the landlords' residences in Carlow? Well, following its victory in the general election of 1933, Fianna Fáil, with a new Land Act in 1933, it reduced all annuity payments by 50%, and it made it easier for the Land Commission to acquire certain categories of land. The only owners whose lands were not liable to be acquired by the Land Commission were those who were practical farmers, it said, farming their land in a proper manner. That meant giving adequate employment and producing an adequate amount of food, and who resided on or near their lands. However, the Land Commission was slow in acquiring land in Carlow, both under the 1923 and the 1933 Land Acts, as a number of landowners undertook successful legal challenges against the takeover of their lands. The Land Commission was overruled by its own judicial commissioner in a number of cases when it moved to acquire land under the 1923 Act. And the most significant of these was the Vesey estate of 2,500 acres near Hacketstown, which successfully resisted attempts by locals to have the Land Commission divided up in 1930. However, in 1942, when this same Vesey estate was about to be sold, the Land Commission wasn't prepared to purchase it because of the difficult wartime conditions. So the lands were sold to Thomas Donnelly, the Belfast distilling family, who set up a stud farm there. There were similar successful appeals to the Land Commission's appeals body under the 1933 Land Act. The Commission failed in its attempt in 1937 to acquire the 700 acres of the Alexander estate in Milford when the owner lodged an appeal. The appeals tribunal ruled in Alexander's favour in 1941, and this represented a considerable setback for the Land Commission's efforts to secure lands in Carlow, and the matter was raised in the Dáil, but to no effect really, more than 4 years later. Now, the difficult conditions of World War II and its aftermath also prevented the Land Commission from acquiring other estates in Carlow, which could have been divided. As we have seen in the case of the Vesey estate. Another example of that was the 150-acre Slowcock estate in Milford. That was inspected by the Land Commission in October 1937 with a view to purchasing it. But in December 1941 and again in 1944, the Land Commission said it decided not to acquire the lands owing to the emergency condition, i.e. the war. And in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, the Land Commission made virtually no progress with land division in Carlow. During the 7 years from 1947 to 1953, there were less than 600 acres in total was divided. Quick look at the Butler estate. The Butlers went to live in London when their palatial house on an estate of over 1,000 acres near Tullow was accidentally burned in 1917. Now, the Land Commission acquired the house only in 1952, and the 600 acres of the estate was divided among 12 small farmers in 1954, and the rest was taken over by the State Forestry Authority. Yeah, something like that. In the Brown's Hill domain of Brown Clayton, with 750 acres, and Bruen's 1,500 acres in Oak Park were targeted for distribution by the Land Commission during the 1930s and later. The Land Commission began the process of acquiring Brown's Hill in 1937, but when the owner lodged an objection, the Land Commission did not pursue the purchase, and the lands were sold to English investors in 1952. The English owners of Brown's Hill worked the land for several years and then sold a portion of it. And the same English investors bought Oak Park, which was sold following Bruen's death in 1954. And when threats were made against the new owners, they sold both properties to the Land Commission in 1959-1960. And the Land Commission divided the remaining 500 acres of Brown's Hill among small farmers at that time. And some 700 acres of Oak Park was also divided by the Land Commission, with the remaining lands becoming a research centre for the Agricultural Institute. And Bruen's former agricultural workers in Oak Park were employed by the Agricultural Institute. The division of Brown's Hill and Oak Park represented a significant achievement by local land agitators, mainly the Bennekerry Land Club, led by Kathleen Brady. Miss Brady said that the only unfortunate thing was that there just wasn't enough land to go around, and some people who could have done with a bit got none. And apart from a few instances, the Brands Hill and Oak Park transactions marked the last substantial land division in Carlow. The Land Commission ceased acquiring land in 1983 and was finally wound up in 1999. So overall, over a period of 80 years, landholding in Carlow had been transformed due to a combination of agrarian pressure, action by both the British and Irish governments, and of course the passage of time when it became possible to earn a living from farming only by having access to ever increasing amounts of land. And so the smallholders disappeared inevitably with the passage of time. And I'll leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your attention.